Sunset colored the streets golden orange, and soft light lingered on the cracked asphalt. People in the neighborhood were hurrying home after a long day, but 17-year-old Michael walked leisurely, enjoying the silence. It was a familiar path for him. From school to home, just a 10-minute walk. In the pocket of his backpack were his textbooks, and in the other was his notebook, his only way to explain himself to the people around him. He had been deaf since birth. It made his world quieter, but by no means less colorful. He felt the vibration of the gravel beneath his feet, caught the smell of the evening air mixed with the aroma of freshly baked bread from the bakery around the corner. He liked this route, the familiar faces, the tranquility of the neighborhood. He could already see his street ahead. He would be home in a little while, where his mother was waiting for him with dinner. But around the corner, something changed. He noticed a black and white police car standing by the curb. A man in uniform stood leaning on the hood, holding a walkie-talkie. Nothing unusual, Michael thought as he continued walking. He didn't hear the policeman shout the first words. "Hey, you! Stop!" Michael didn't stop, not because he ignored the order, but because he wasn't even aware of it. He kept walking until he felt a shadow approach him from behind. A powerful hand grabbed his shoulder roughly. The boy turned around sharply, and then their gazes met. The policeman was a tall, stocky man with a cold, tense face. He had a look of irritation in his eyes. "Are you deaf?" He gritted his teeth. Michael blinked, looking at him confused. He opened his mouth to say something, but the words he couldn't say were stuck inside. Instead, he reached into his pocket to pull out a notepad. But the policeman didn't wait for an explanation. When he saw the movement, he assumed the teenager was reaching for something dangerous. His voice grew louder, almost hysterical. "I said freeze! Hands in the air!" Michael froze, his heart racing. He tried to gesture that he didn't understand, but the gesture was interpreted differently. "Are you kidding me?" The cop lost his temper. The world that had seemed so quiet and peaceful a moment ago was now in chaos. Everything Michael had known, his neighborhood, the people he passed every day, was suddenly alien and hostile. His attempts to explain the situation through gestures only added to the confusion. The policeman pushed him forcefully to the ground, wrenching his hands behind his back. The rough blows, the shouts, the cold metal of the handcuffs on his wrists, all of it shattered his reality, piece by piece. The people around him froze, watching a boy who had done nothing being brutally humiliated right on the street. And somewhere in that moment, in the rough grip of someone else's hands, Michael realized his silence, his stillness, was not just the absence of sound. It was an abyss that no one wanted or intended to bridge. Officer John Reeves has been on the police force for almost 15 years. In that time, he has seen a lot: robberies, shootings, street fights, and each time he has come home with the feeling that the world is getting worse. His neighborhood, once quiet and prosperous, was now teeming with threats in his eyes. John no longer saw people here. He saw categories: criminals, potential offenders, and those who, in his opinion, just hadn't been caught yet. Reeves had always prided himself on his intuition. "I can spot a suspicious person a block away," he liked to say. But his intuition was imbued with bias. If you're black and young, then you're probably troubled. If you're wearing a hoodie or walking with a backpack, then there's probably something illegal in it. These thoughts were not questionable for John. They were part of his job, an automaticity that only grew stronger with each passing year. That night, as he stood outside his patrol car, his eyes immediately locked on Michael. The guy with the backpack walking slowly down the sidewalk. It was the first time John had seen him. He's definitely not from our neighborhood, his mind flashed. Michael wasn't dressed like someone from trouble, but that wasn't enough for John. Too quiet. Probably high, he thought as he watched the teenager approach. Reeves tensed immediately. His fingers reflexively clenched on the radio, and he took a few steps forward, blocking the sidewalk. "Hey!" he shouted loudly, as he was accustomed to using his voice to indicate dominance at once. When Michael didn't respond, that was John's first signal. His mind went into alarm mode. He's ignoring it. Maybe he's hiding something, he thought, feeling the familiar irritation rise to his throat. He wasn't used to being ignored. In his world, ignoring meant defiance. He quickened his steps and grabbed the teenager roughly by the shoulder. When he saw Michael's confused face, John was even angrier. He took that look, confused, frightened, as a challenge. He's faking it, pretending not to understand. His mind flashed. Michael reached into his pocket, and that's when John saw the threat. To him, it was simple. A black teenager reaching for something meant it was a weapon. He didn't wait for clarification. He didn't ask questions. Everything he'd been taught and everything he'd instilled in himself over his many years of service screamed one thing. "Do it! Hands up now!" John shouted, feeling the adrenaline rush through his body. But Michael disobeyed again. To John, it wasn't just a gesture, it was an insult. He didn't know the teenager was deaf, and even if he had known, it would hardly have changed his reaction. He'd already made up his mind. This kid was a threat. John remembered the incident a year ago when a black guy had injured his coworker. He couldn't get the video of teenagers from the same neighborhood robbing a store out of his mind. Those images were forming in his mind into a single, consistent stereotype. They're all the same. And now he didn't see a kid just walking home. He saw a symbol, a danger, someone to be controlled. It all happened in seconds. John pushed Michael, throwing him to the ground. The guy didn't fight back, but John didn't see it. All he saw was a threat to be eliminated. Reeves felt a familiar sense of power as he pressed his knee against the teen's back, pinning his arms around him. "You're not leaving," he said, almost with pleasure, though Michael didn't even hear the words. In the crowd that had begun to gather around him, John noticed judgmental looks, but he paid them no attention. Just more liberals who don't understand anything, he thought with annoyance. For him, it was just another day on the job, but for Michael, it was the beginning of the end of his faith in justice. Let's pause for a moment. Write in the comments where you're listening to our stories from. Have you ever had a time in your life when you faced injustice or prejudice? It's important for us to hear your stories. If you're interested in what you're listening to right now, subscribe so you don't miss the next episodes. And now we continue. Michael felt the officer's tense hand on his shoulder, turning him toward himself with such force that he almost lost his balance. The jerk was rough, almost violent, and Michael froze in a daze. His eyes widened and he stared at the policeman, but he didn't hear a single word, only saw his lips moving quickly and aggressively, his face turning red with anger. "Are you kidding me?" I said, "Stop." Reeves raised his voice to a shout, his words sounding like an order. Michael didn't move, not because he didn't want to, but because he didn't understand what they wanted him to do. He tried to gesture to explain, to put his hands palms forward, to show that he was not a threat, but the policeman only got angrier. "Stop waving your arms around, okay?" Reeves growled, mistaking the gestures for sarcastic defiance. He didn't see the deaf teenager in front of him. In his eyes, Michael was just another sneaky, cocky offender trying to get away with it. His automatism, that mixture of fear and aggression honed by years of service, dictated one thing: if he didn't obey, he was guilty. "Can you hear me?" I said. "Stop." Reeves stepped closer, shoving Michael in the chest. The teen took a step back, instinctively pulling away. He didn't want a conflict. He just wanted to explain that he couldn't hear. But in Reeves's eyes, that step back looked like an attempt to escape. "Oh, so you want to escape, huh?" The officer grinned, his face contorted with anger. "Is that how it's gonna be? You think I'm gonna mess with you?" The crowd around them began to gather. A few people stopped in the distance, watching as a tall white policeman pressed his presence on a teenager who looked confused and defenseless. Someone pulled out a cell phone to film what was happening. But no one intervened. Everyone knew how such situations usually ended. Reeves moved even closer, his face now almost touching Michael's. "Let me see your hands. What's in your pockets?" he shouted with such force that even the passers-by on the sidelines shuddered. Michael, trembling, pulled a notepad from his pocket. Reeves saw the movement and instantly grabbed the holster of his gun. His eyes darted downward, but when he realized it was only a notebook, he felt the flash of rage again. "What is this? Are you kidding me? You think if you play the silent man, I'll let you go?" His voice grew louder and louder, a mixture of anger and humiliation. Michael tried to hold out his notebook, showing that he wanted to explain, but Reeves shoved him so sharply that the guy fell to the ground. "Don't move! Face down!" he commanded. Michael didn't move. Not because he obeyed, but because he was in complete shock. He didn't understand what he was being accused of. What had he done? He lay on the cold asphalt, feeling the officer's rough hands cupping his hands behind his back. Shouts were heard all around. Someone shouted, "Leave him alone. He didn't do anything." But Reeves didn't hear those words. To him, it was a normal situation. The crowd shouting in defense of the criminal, and him, the hero, establishing order. "You wanted to show me something? You're not the type to point things out to me, okay?" He growled, clasping the teenager's hands more tightly than necessary. Michael's deafness, his attempts to explain himself, even the notebook that lay nearby, forgotten and crumpled, were all lost in this moment. In Reeves's eyes, he was just another suspicious type. Michael felt his face pressed against the rough asphalt, and behind him, words were being spoken that he would never hear. He didn't know that his life was about to change forever, becoming a symbol of injustice that thousands of people would talk about. For a second, the street froze. Michael, lying on the ground, was barely breathing, his eyes wandering around as if he were looking for help. But all he saw were blurred silhouettes, passers-by who had stopped but were afraid to interfere. Some hid their eyes, others clutched their phones, filming what was happening, but no one said a word. Police officer John Reeves, on the other hand, only felt more and more powerful. "Did you think you could ignore me? Not answer me?" Reeves shouted, his voice echoing between the brick walls. Michael tried to raise his head to explain himself, but Reeves slapped him sharply on the back. It was a strong, calculated blow, the kind he used to subdue those who disobeyed. I said, "Don't move. Do you hear me?" His shout sounded like he was talking to a rock, his voice filled with rage and contempt. Michael raised his hands again, trying to gesture that he couldn't hear. But Reeves saw the movement differently. He saw it as another act of resistance, an attempt to escape responsibility. Are you the kind of guy who thinks he can spit on the law? What? Did you think there were exceptions for you? The policeman grabbed Michael by the collar and jerked him to his knees. The teenager's shirt ripped open, exposing his shoulder, and he felt the hot air mixed with pain. Reeves pushed him again, now face down, so that Michael's head hit the sidewalk. The boy's face was covered with tiny scratches, and a thin trickle of blood ran down his cheek. "That's for you for deciding to pull this circus with your silence," Reeves hissed, leaning over him. The officer's screams grew even louder, sharper. Michael couldn't hear them, but he could see the rage on his face, see his mouth shouting words filled with anger. "Thought you could point your fingers at me, huh? These gestures of yours aren't going to help me." Reeves spat on the ground, his voice full of contempt. "We have laws here, and you either respect them or I'll teach you." Someone in the crowd shrieked, "Stop it! He's just a kid!" But that only irritated Reeves. He lifted his head and glanced at the people who were beginning to gather around him. "A child?" There was an almost mocking surprise in his voice. "Do you see this child? It's not a child. It's a threat." He turned to Michael, grabbing him by the hair, forcing him to lift his head. "Look, there he is, one of those people who thinks he can do anything. But you know what? Not on my shift." Michael felt the policeman's knee pressed into his back. He tried to gesture that he couldn't hear, that he didn't understand, but Reeves kept yelling at him, ignoring everything. "Did someone teach you that?" His voice got even louder. "Have you ever seen it done before? Answer me." Michael frantically tried to breathe. His body was shaking, and he didn't know what else to do to stop it. Suddenly, he felt another jolt. It was no longer just an order. It was rage turned into physical pain. Reeves picked Michael up by the scruff of his neck and threw him to the ground again. The crowd began to protest louder. "You're out of your mind," shouted one of the passers-by, but no one came any closer. Reeves turned to the crowd and shouted, "One more step and I'll take you too. Want some?" His gaze was filled with rage. He could feel the power. He could taste it like adrenaline in his blood. It wasn't about law. It wasn't about law and order. It was about control. On the asphalt, among the dust and crumbs of glass, Michael lay crushed by humiliation and pain. He'd never heard the screams of the crowd, never heard Reeves's threats, but he felt it. Felt all the hatred that was now bearing down on him. Felt the weight of a system that left no chance. It wasn't just an explosion of aggression. It was an example of how a single figure can become the embodiment of all the cruelty and injustice that corrodes society. And this explosion left scars not only on Michael's body, but also on the souls of those who witnessed this tragedy. Lying on the cold asphalt, Michael involuntarily closed his eyes. In those seconds, his mind drifted to a place where he wasn't beaten, pushed, or humiliated. He tried to escape from reality, but instead of calm, he was met with memories, scraps of the past that burned in his mind like an old movie with a crackling film. He was born in a small house on the outskirts of town, where the windows had long since faded and the roof was patched every year by the old neighbors. His mother, Julia, worked 2 jobs and still barely made ends meet. When Michael was 2 years old, the doctors diagnosed him with deafness. His mother cried all night, and his father left a few months later, unable to cope with the severity of the situation. "We don't need this load," he said as he gathered his things. Michael never heard those words, but they were like a scar in his mother's heart. Julia didn't give up. She fought for her son as hard as she could. She taught him gestures, explained that he was just like everyone else, and that he had the right to dream. But Michael realized from an early age that the world does not like people like him. At school, the kids made fun of him. They teased him for the way he moved his arms, for the way he tried to speak, for his strange, distorted sounds. Deaf, dumb, dumb, dumb. These words became his shadows, and they followed him in the hallways, in the cafeteria, even on his way home. Teachers didn't try to interfere, and some looked at him with the same expression as the policeman tonight: distrust and judgment. Memories pierced him. How once his classmates had hidden his backpack and he had searched for it all day until the principal found it behind the school, dirty and torn. Or how in gym class a boy pushed him so hard that he fell and broke his finger. All the teacher said was, "It's your own fault. You should be faster." But, in spite of all this, Michael tried. He learned to read lips, diligently did his homework to be a better student. He dreamed of one day stepping outside of this neighborhood where every face was a mask hiding contempt. Years passed, but the system did not change. Michael and his mother constantly felt the scrutiny of society. People thought that being poor and black meant one thing: they must be to blame. When Julia once tried to complain about injustice at school, the principal said, "Maybe you should consider that it's not the school, it's your son. Maybe he just doesn't belong here." Those words echoed in Michael's head every time he saw people avert their eyes as they walked by, but he tried. Despite everything, he got up every morning, walked to school, walked home. He dreamed of the day when he could be just a man, not a black deaf boy. And today was no different. He wanted nothing more than to go home, sit at the table with his mother, write something in his notebook, and share his thoughts with her. He didn't want the world to accept him. He just wanted the world to leave him alone. But the world didn't. Those who grew up around him saw how he was always looked at differently. Too suspicious, too evaluative. A neighbor, old Mr. Brown, once told his mother, "You'd better get out of here. They'll never give us any peace here." Today, Michael realized how right Mr. Brown had been. He felt it with his whole body when Officer Reeves yelled at him, hit him, humiliated him. That police officer didn't see the boy in front of him who was struggling every day of his life. He saw only a threat, a problem, a stereotype. At some point, lying on the ground, Michael opened his eyes again. He looked at the crowd, at the people who had made no move to help him, and he realized that in this world, deafness was not just for him. It was everyone who had not heard his silent cries for help. Michael lay on the ground, feeling his heart pounding frantically. He tried to turn around, but the policeman's rough hand pressed his face into the cold asphalt again. All he could do was raise his hands, repeating the same gestures that to him meant, "I can't hear. I don't understand." But it was useless. To Officer Reeves, these movements looked like something else entirely. In his mind, Michael was not trying to explain his deafness. He was fighting back. Every gesture of the teenager looked like a challenge in Reeves's eyes, like something aggressive and threatening. "Stop waving your arms around. I'm not your toy," Reeves shouted, but he didn't realize that his words were falling into a soundless void. Michael raised his hands in an attempt to indicate, "Please, let me explain." But the policeman saw it differently. He grabbed the boy's wrists and snapped them sharply behind his back, so that Michael cried out in pain. The cry was weak and almost silent, as if the last of the air had been knocked out of him. "What? You think I don't know what you're doing?" Reeves's voice was filled with contempt. "Did you want to reach for something? Do you have a knife? A weapon? That's why you were waving your arms around, isn't it?" Michael tried his best to show with gestures that he didn't understand, didn't hear. He touched his neck and ears again, showing that he was deaf, but that only made Reeves more angry. "Is that some kind of signal? Are you trying to call for help?" He jerked the boy to his feet and threw him against the police car, making his shoulder hit the hard metal. Michael squirmed in pain. The crowd around him was growing larger, but still as silent. Someone was whispering. Someone was filming on their phone, but no one interfered. "You're looking at me like you don't understand anything," Reeves continued to shout. "What are you trying to say? That you're special? Are you above the law?" The policeman stood in front of him, breathing heavily, his face twisted with anger. To him, Michael was just another typical spokesman, a black kid trying to play his own game, who supposedly can't hear. All of these gestures that Michael repeated only irritated Reeves more. Michael shook his head, his eyes pleading. He raised his hands again and slowly made a motion that meant, "I'm deaf." But for Reeves, it was the final blow. "Are you threatening me? Is this some kind of sign? Are you a gang member?" The policeman stepped forward and punched Michael in the chest so that he fell to the ground again. "I'll show you who's boss." The crowd gasped. Someone shouted, "Stop it! He didn't do anything." But Reeves didn't even turn his head. The familiar rush of adrenaline, the feeling of power, swept over him. He looked at the boy lying on the ground and saw not a man, but the threat he had just neutralized. Michael reached again for his backpack, which had been tossed nearby. He wanted to pull out a notepad, wanted to write what he couldn't say, but Reeves stepped on his hand again. "Don't even think about it." His voice was low and fierce. For Michael, it was worse than physical pain. His silence, his attempts to explain himself became a reason for more blows and humiliation. No one saw his desperation. No one understood what it was like to scream without a sound when no one wanted to see your truth. All he wanted to do was explain, "I can't hear. I didn't do anything." But his silence became a weapon against himself. Reeves grabbed Michael by his shirt, lifted him up, and whispered directly into his face. "You're silent, but I can see right through you. You think you can hide behind your deafness? I see dozens of people like you every day. You're all the same." Those words cut into Michael's soul harder than any blow. He knew he couldn't explain anything. His silence was not only his tragedy, but also a wall behind which society would never want to see him. And at that moment, Michael realized that even if he waved his arms, writhed, screamed, nothing would change. To people like Reeves, he was just a shadow, just a stereotype they had made up. His silence was his stigma, and this cop had done everything he could to turn it into a tool of destruction. The crowd continued to grow, but every step, every attempt at resistance by Michael only increased Reeves's aggression. His gestures were not heard. His silence was not understood. And that night was Michael's moment to see how quickly the world can break someone who can't scream. Let's pause for one more brief moment. Write in the comments where you are hearing our stories from. Have you experienced injustice or prejudice? Share your experiences. It's important. And if you're interested in this story, subscribe so you don't miss the next episodes. And now we continue. The crowd around them continued to grow. People watched, whispered, but no one intervened. Michael lay on the pavement, crushed by the weight of the policeman's aggression, and his silence, His silent attempts to explain himself went unheard. But at that moment, in the very epicenter of injustice, there was someone who could possibly change the course of this story. Evan Carter, a journalist and independent activist, was walking down the street, hurrying home after a meeting with colleagues. His camera was always with him, a trusty tool to capture the truth that others often turned away from. He had not planned anything special for today, but the noise and crowds of people caught his attention. "What's going on here?" Evan stepped closer, his gaze immediately noticing the policeman standing over the teenager. He pulled out his camera and started filming. Through the lens, he saw everything. The motionless body of the boy lying face down, his bleeding cheek, the officer who stood over his prey like a tiger, ignoring the protests of the crowd. "Stay back," Reeves shouted when he saw Evan, and there was tension in his voice. Evan didn't stop. He kept filming, his camera capturing every gesture, every movement. "What's going on, officer?" he asked calmly but firmly, stepping even closer. "Why is that boy on the ground? Did he do something?" Reeves reacted instantly. His face contorted, and he took a few steps toward Evan. "Get back. It's none of your business," he said sharply, trying to cover the camera with his body. But Evan didn't move. He held the camera high, still recording what was happening. "It seems to be my case," he said. "You seem to have overstepped your authority." Those words sounded like a blow. The crowd around him stirred, people whispering louder. Reeves felt his confidence crack. Until this moment, he had been completely absorbed in his power, his control. But now, there was a man with a camera in front of him, a man who could turn everything he'd done into evidence. He fought back, Reeves said sharply, turning to the crowd. "I'm doing my job." Evan raised his hand, pointing at Michael. "This boy is lying on the ground, beaten. Has he said anything to you at all? Have you noticed that he can't speak? That he probably can't hear you?" Reeves froze. His face flashed with anger. "I don't have to answer your questions," he shouted. But his voice didn't sound as confident as it had before. Michael lifted his head. His gaze met the camera. For a moment he saw the light of hope. A man who was not just watching, but fixing, memorizing every detail. Michael reached into his pocket, trying again to pull out the notepad. "What are you doing?" Reeves pinned him to the ground again, causing the crowd to shriek. "Leave him alone," Evan shouted. "Can't you see? He just wants to explain something." Reeves turned back to the crowd, then back to Evan. His mind was racing. He felt like he was losing control of the situation. The camera pointed at him was his biggest nightmare. He knew that any wrong move now could cost him his career. "Put the camera away," he said, trying to speak calmly, but his voice shook. "This is a private situation." Evan grinned. "That's not true. This is a public street, and what you're doing is an abuse of power." Reeves clenched his fists. He felt his power slipping away, his confidence crumbling under the weight of the crowd's stares and the cold lens of the camera. He realized that every second was now being recorded. "I'm acting within the law," he mumbled, as if justifying himself. Evan stepped closer. "Then let the law explain why this boy was beaten. You think no one will see that? That no one will ask questions?" Reeves looked nervously at Michael, then back at the crowd. He saw them differently now, not as silent spectators but as people who could be witnesses. He realized that his actions no longer remained in the shadows. "Pick him up," Evan said, looking straight into the policeman's eyes. "If he's a suspect, you can detain him, but not humiliate him." The crowd murmured approvingly. People began to move closer, daring Evan to do so. Reeves felt himself losing control of the situation. He took a step back, trying to hide his confusion. His voice was no longer firm. "I'll call for backup," he muttered, backing away to his car. Evan still had the camera pointed at him as Reeves got into the patrol car and frantically reached for his radio. At that moment, something changed for Michael. He realized that he was no longer alone, that there was someone willing to watch and record the truth, someone who was not afraid to stand up to the system. But he also realized that this was only the first step. He didn't feel safe yet. He had a long way to go to make sure this day wasn't just another episode of forgotten cruelty. Michael lay in the hospital room, motionless and silent. The stitches glistened on his face, and the abrasions on his arms and shoulders were a reminder of how cruel the evening had been. His mother sat beside him, holding his hand, her eyes swollen with tears. She didn't say a word, but her grief, mixed with impotent rage, filled the room. Behind the door of the room, doctors and social workers could be heard talking. Everyone had their own version of what had happened, their own questions, but none of them knew how to explain what had happened, how to explain that a child who was just walking home ended up in such a state. Meanwhile, at the police station, Officer John Reeves was telling his version of events. His tone was confident, but inside he was seething. He knew he would have to explain himself to his superiors, to the press, to all those liberals who had him on camera. But Reeves wasn't about to plead guilty. "The teenager behaved aggressively," he said, sitting at his desk in the supervisor's office. "He was ignoring my orders. I thought he might have been armed. Everything I did was within the law." The station chief, an elderly man with a stern look, listened silently. He realized that the situation smelled of scandal, and he had already heard the calls from higher authorities. "Do you realize that everything is now written down?" he asked coldly. "The video is already on the internet, and it doesn't look not good." Reeves frowned. "I did the right thing. If any of you think I should have stood by and watched him flail his arms when I don't know what he's hiding, then maybe I don't belong here." The words sounded like a challenge. The chief looked at him carefully. "You need to understand, John. It's not just you against the guy on the street. This case is going to the media now. People want blood. They want justice." Reeves grinned. "This is another witch hunt. They want to make me a symbol because I'm a white cop and he's a black guy. Nobody even asked me how I felt at the time." But the supervisor knew the problem was deeper than that. It wasn't just one person's mistake. It was a symptom of the system. Meanwhile, a video of the incident shot by Evan Carter went viral on social media. People saw the beaten boy, saw the coldness and aggression of the police officer, and heard the screams of the crowd. Hashtags like #Justice for Michael and #End. Police brutality became trends. Evan actively participated in the discussion by posting details of the investigation, learning about Reeves's background and history of service. It turned out that this was not the first time an officer had exceeded his authority. In 2019, he arrested a teenager for resisting, but then it turned out that he simply didn't understand the orders. Evan wrote in one of his posts, "How many more cases like this have been hushed up?" The disclosure of these details caused a wave of outrage. People demanded action, demanded Reeves's firing and criminal charges. But Reeves himself continued to maintain that he had done the right thing. Michael, meanwhile, was struggling with injuries not only physical, but emotional. Every touch from the doctor, every gesture reminded him of his hands pawing at the pavement, his face pressed into the dust. It was hard for him to sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Reeves's face again, his eyes full of rage. Michael's mother, Julia, wasn't just sitting in the hospital now. She was more determined than ever. Her son was not the first to be the victim of such cruelty, but she was determined that he would be the last. "I want him to answer for this," she told the lawyer the activists found. "He looked at my son and saw a criminal. But my son is not a criminal. The case went public. An internal investigation was launched against Reeves, but the process was slow, as it always is when the system tries to protect itself. We are looking into the details," police officials said. The policeman was acting in an uncertain environment. To many, those words sounded like an excuse. There were no conditions of uncertainty. Evans stated in an interview, "It was a teenager, a deaf teenager. All he tried to do was explain that he couldn't hear, and it turned into a beating. But even with the video, with eyewitness testimony, many doubted Reeves would be punished. In the past, such cases have only resulted in light disciplinary action. The system protects its own," the activists said. And this is not the first time. For Michael, this trial was not about justice. He didn't understand why his injuries and suffering had become a topic of contention. All he wanted was for someone to look at him and see him not as a threat, but as a human being. But for the community, this case was more than the story of one boy. It was a clash of two worlds, those who defended law enforcement and those who saw it as a source of fear. The question remained, would this case be a moment of change, or would it be another episode to be forgotten in a few weeks? The system was holding strong, but a crack had already appeared, and Michael had unknowingly caused it. Michael's story spread like flames on dry grass. Social networks and news portals exploded with discussion. A video made by Evan Carter went viral, racking up thousands of views every minute. But the heart of the story was more than insult and cruelty. It spoke of a silence that no one wanted to hear. Media headlines included, "Deaf teenager beaten for disobedience, police or bias." Logically, when silence becomes a threat. However, this story did more than just cause shock. It opened an invisible door into the world of those who face injustice every day, because they are not heard. Television programs and radio shows have begun to invite experts on the rights of people with disabilities. On one such program, a prominent disability rights advocate, Sarah Livingston, spoke bitterly. People with hearing loss live in constant danger that their silence will be interpreted as a challenge. Michael is just one example. He is not the first, and I fear he will not be the last. Her words resonated with the audience. She recounted cases of deaf people being arrested for ignoring police commands when their gestures were deemed a threat. But we shouldn't just talk about deafness, she continued. We should be talking about how bias reinforces the problem. Why was Michael, a black teenager, immediately perceived as a threat? Why did his silence become an excuse for violence? Her words sparked heated discussions. A debate broke out on air. One of the former police officers said, "You must realize that working on the streets involves great risk. Police officers cannot know that there is a person with a disability in front of them. They don't have time to think." Sarah objected. "But they have time to beat up teenagers? Is that an excuse?" Michael gestured that he couldn't hear. You could tell. The problem is that he wasn't given a chance. Michael's deafness became a symbol of an invisible problem. Thousands of people with hearing loss began sharing their stories online. One woman wrote, I was stopped by the police once. I couldn't hear their commands, but when I tried to gesture to explain, they thought I was showing signs of a gang. I was arrested in front of my children. Another man said, "When you can't hear, you live in a world that is always one step ahead of you." Michael was just walking home, but to those who watched him, he was a threat, because they couldn't understand why he was silent. Meanwhile, Michael's mother, Julia, began to speak publicly about her pain. At a press conference organized by activists, she addressed a crowd of journalists. "My son can't hear. He can't speak the way we do, but that doesn't make him any less of a person. It doesn't give anyone the right to treat him as an enemy." She paused, her voice trembling, but she didn't give up. "I know he wouldn't be considered a threat if he looked different, if his skin was a different color, if he were part of the system they're protecting. But he's not, and now he's paying the price." These words stirred the audience. Journalists highlighted not only the incident itself, but also the general problem of bias. Michael's tragedy became a symbol of two problems: systemic racism and discrimination on the basis of disability. On a popular talk show, Evan Carter, the journalist who made the video, gave a speech that literally shocked the audience. "When I shot this video, I didn't just see a boy lying on the ground. I saw a system that crushed him because it is incapable of discernment. To it, Michael was just a black boy who didn't comply. He was not a person, but a problem to be solved." Evan spoke bitterly. "As a journalist, I see how many stories get left in the shadows. How many Michaels never make the news? How many of their silences are never heard?" His words drew a round of applause. More importantly, it set off a chain reaction. Disability rights organizations have launched campaigns demanding mandatory training for police officers on how to interact with the hearing impaired. But not everyone was ready for change. In an anonymous interview, a police officer said, "We can't read minds. If someone looks suspicious, we have to act." Now, they're trying to make the cop look like a monster, but he was just doing his job. These words caused a new wave of indignation. People demanded reform. They wanted change. Michael's story was the beginning of a new movement. In social networks, activists launched the hashtag #Hear the Silence, calling attention to the problems faced by deaf and hard of hearing people. There were speeches at the rallies. It's not just about Michael. It's about everyone who isn't heard. It's about everyone who is seen as a threat simply because they are different. Michael was still in the hospital when his mother brought him the first article from the newspaper. He looked at it, read the words, but couldn't understand why he had become the person thousands of people were talking about. He wished he hadn't. He wished he could be left alone. But now his story was bigger than himself. The voice of the silent ones, which for years no one wanted to hear, finally began to sound. It's been weeks since the night that changed Michael and his family's lives forever. But what seemed like a hopeless tragedy at the time became the spark that could ignite the fire of change. Michael's story didn't get lost in a sea of news. It lived on, reminding society of its darkest wounds. Michael was still in rehab. His physical injuries were slowly healing, but the deep scars in his soul remained. Every night he woke up in a cold sweat, remembering the blows, the screams, and the cold asphalt on which he had been pressed. But his mother, Julia, didn't let herself break down. She turned her pain into a determination to fight. She gave interviews, met with lawyers, attended rallies. Her voice was firm, even as her insides screamed with grief. "I have lost faith in this system," she said at one of the meetings organized by activists. but I will not lose faith in my son, and I will make sure he is heard. With the help of lawyers and community organizations, Julia filed a lawsuit against Officer John Reeves and the city's police department. The move was bold, but extremely risky. The system rarely breaks down under pressure from one person. But Julia knew she had thousands of people behind her who no longer wanted to be silent. Michael's story became the catalyst for a national movement. People took to the streets with placards. "Do you hear us?" Component placement. Justice for Michael. Silence is not a crime. Social media campaigns such as #HearTheSilence and #Justice for Michael continued to gain momentum. Michael has become a symbol of the struggle for those who have been ignored for too long. His name was heard not only in the context of police brutality, but also in discussions about people with disabilities. At one of the biggest rallies in Washington, D.C., Sarah Livingston spoke. "We're not just here today for Michael. We're here for every deaf child who is afraid of being misunderstood, for every person who is considered a threat because of the color of their skin. We're here to say, enough." The Reeves trial was a national event. A police officer who had previously felt he was the master of the streets now sat in a courtroom surrounded by lawyers. His defense was based on one thing: he had acted within his authority. It was a difficult situation, his lawyer said. The officer had a right to defend himself. He could not have known that the teenager was deaf. But Michael's side presented undeniable evidence. Evan Carter's video showed that Michael did not resist, that his gestures were an attempt to explain his deafness. Sign language experts confirmed this. "He couldn't hear the commands," one of the experts said, "but he was trying to show it." The problem was that Officer Reeves didn't want to see it. Other witnesses also spoke at the trial. People with hearing impairment shared their stories, telling how their silence was often a sign of guilt to the community. But the most emotional moment came when Julia, Michael's mother, addressed the court. "I'm not asking this man to bring my son back that night. That's impossible. But I'm asking you to let him know that his actions had consequences." The court sentenced Reeves to dismissal from the police force and also ordered him to pay a fine. But many activists were unhappy with the decision. They wanted more: criminal prosecution. "It's a step forward, but it's not justice," said Sarah Livingston. "If the system continues to protect people like Reeves, the system itself remains a criminal." Michael and his family were compensated, but Julia knew the money would not restore her son's faith in people. Under public pressure, several states have introduced mandatory training for police officers on how to interact with people with disabilities. There have been initiatives to introduce new technologies, such as special badges or bracelets that could alert police officers to a person's deafness. But the activists realized this was just the tip of the iceberg. "We have to change the mindset," said Evan Carter. "It's not technology that will save us from bias. It's the desire to see people as people." For Michael, life had changed forever. He was no longer the quiet boy who could disappear into the crowd. Now he was being looked at, written about, listened to, and it was scary. His mother once told him, "You can shut yourself away, or you can become someone who makes the world a better place. It's your choice." Michael decided he would not be silent. He started visiting schools and talking about his experiences. He talked to other teenagers with disabilities, helping them to feel stronger. Michael's story was left unfinished. He knew his case wouldn't change the system overnight, but he believed that even a shadow of hope could be the beginning of light. Society began to move forward. People began to ask more questions. Police officers were increasingly confronted with calls that required more than just force. And while the system remained stubborn and unfair, one story, one boy reminded the world, silence can speak louder than shouting. A light of hope flickered somewhere in the distance, and Michael walked toward it, no matter what. Write in the comments what you think about this story. Have you ever experienced racism or injustice in your life? We really need to hear your thoughts and your stories. We appreciate each and every one of you and thank you for being with us. If you enjoyed this issue, please subscribe to our channel and give us a like to support us. Write the phrase, "Silence also has a voice," in the comments so we know you listened to the end of this story. We wish you a good day and justice in your life.